Well, there we are. And we are from West Hollywood tonight, from Marilyn Monroe's former apartment. And I have to tell you, it's going to be a lot of fun because we have something. And as you know, many of you know, I lived in Tampa, Florida for many years. And one of the favorite hotels of Mr. Al Capone is on Davis Island there. And he's a superstar there, certainly a superstar coast to coast in the United States. Who can forget Geraldo opening the dreaded safe some years ago, created enormous ratings cume for Fox Television and others that did follow up on that. But there's also a story that most of us are not familiar with because most of us have never and may never meet an actual living, breathing family member. So I want to introduce Deirdre Marie Capone. She has written a book called Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family. This book started to be written in the 1950s. She had to change her name, has gone through a variety of different permutations, affectations, and interfrastications in order to get this thing done. It's now available and ready to go. And I think the best way to hear about it is from the voice of Deirdre herself. And thank you for joining us tonight on Harrison's Hangout and the Smart Show.
Thank you for having me. I'm enjoying being here. I've never done anything like this before.
Well, we love pulling people into the 21st century. Not that we're expert at it, but our fantasy is that we're somehow on the cutting edge. But we really are here. And this is really a new format because people are going to be able to watch you, Marie, on their smartphones, on their iPads, on their computers, as well as listen to you. So it's a much wider platform upon which we can have you presented. And I have never in my life met an actual Capone. This is exciting.
Well, I am an actual Capone. I lived with Al Capone in his house. He taught me to swim, taught me to ride a bike. I cooked with him. We sang together, so I could still hear the sound of his voice in my ear. As a matter of fact, on my website, unclealcapone.com, I have uploaded an audio clip of the actual voice of Al Capone, so people can actually hear what he sounded like.
Wow, which is really extraordinary. So we're going to go grab that piece of audio because I would love to hear it. And you, as you're his niece, is that right?
His grandniece. I'm closer than just a niece. I'm part of his core family. I am the person in charge of the Capone family gravesite. I decide who can be buried there and, who can't. And there's a grave waiting there for me at the foot of Al Capone.
I'm sorry to laugh, but
I know.
I think it's the way you presented it.
I'm going to die one day. So where am I going to go?
Whether you like it or not. So growing up with your Uncle Al Capone, and certainly the notoriety was off the charts. There probably were only a handful of other people alive at the time whose names would have been known universally. This guy was not the Invisible Man. Correct. He was not, Al who? But we think of Tommy Guns and J. Edgar Hoover in his red dress looking like a bulldog in drag. We imagine all this stuff going on. Yep. You're growing up in this, and I imagine in a way you're almost in a bubble because it's so protected.
I was in a bubble. I didn't even tell my children. I have 4 children. I didn't even tell them their heritage until they were in their teenage years because it was so difficult growing up. But, I was in a bubble. When I was with the Capones, of course, it was splendor, everywhere, and whatever you wanted, you could have. And then when I went back to my mom's house, it was Depression time. But that's what I tell in my book, Uncle Al Capone, the untold story from inside his family, how difficult it was to grow up with that name. As a matter of fact, my dad couldn't cope with it, and he committed suicide just before my 11th birthday.
Al Capone, who ended up in Alcatraz, as we know, the Valentine's Day massacre. It was
Exactly.
just Valentine's Day a week ago. Tell us about what you know about the
Correct.
Valentine's Day massacre versus what we have seen from Hollywood.
First of all, no Al Capone, no member of the outfit had anything to do with the Valentine's Day massacre. If Al Capone wanted to get rid of Bugsy Siegel, believe me, he would have, I'm sorry, Bugs Moran, he would have gotten rid of Bugs Moran. It wouldn't have been that mess up. I have a couple of things in my life. For instance, my husband's uncle married the sister of the mechanic that was killed in the Valentine's Day massacre. He would come home and tell his brother the things that were going on. My uncle Matty was outside of the warehouse when things came down. He told me about it. What happened was that the police were stealing cases of alcohol off the back of Bugs Moran's trucks. And when Bugs Moran's soldiers saw that, they went up to him and said, "No, wait, we're all working together here, to give the people what they want. You're not supposed to be doing that. We're going to tell the police captain." And they were afraid that they would get fired, and of course they would have gotten fired. So they were the ones that, perpetrated the deed. I needed to get verification of that before I would put it in my book, Uncle Al Capone. So there's two books that just came out recently. One is Get Capone by Jonathan Eig. The other is Alcatraz, The Gangster Years by Dr. David Ward. They both have the same account that I have in my book. It was the police that did the deed in the Valentine's Day massacre.
Harrison with you. We are talking to Deirdre Marie Capone. She is the grandniece of Al Capone, grew up with Al, started writing this or chronicling her memories in the 1950s. And Deirdre, tell us a little bit about having to change your name, because I think Capone would have put you at that era on the no-fly list if there had been one.
Correct. Well, when my father entered me in school. He enrolled me in school. And when he did, he wanted to try to protect me. So he enrolled me in school as Deirdre Gabriel. My father was Ralph Gabriel Capone. Gabriel was his grandfather's name. And there's a naming order in the Italians, and they tend to stay with the ancestor's name. So I was entered in school as Deirdre Gabriel. Now, Al Capone died on my 7th birthday, January 25th, 1947. That makes me today 72. So the Catholics have, something when they're in second grade, 7 years old, and they make their first communion. So my Italian family, my Capone family, needed something joyous to look forward to since Al just died. So they outfitted me. They did everything for me for the, first communion. And then we all went back to Grandma's, Al's mother's house for a big picnic. Back in those days, there was local editions of the big Chicago papers, and the Chicago Tribune and the Herald American on Monday said, the children at St. Philip Neri, school made their first communion, and Deirdre Capone, with her entire Capone family in attendance, made hers. Well, the children in school and their parents didn't know me as Capone. They knew me as Gabriel. But how many Deirdres do you think were in Chicago in 1947, let alone St. Philip Neri School? So everybody knew who I was. And then 2 weeks later, every single boy and girl in my second grade class except me was invited to this girl's birthday party. And that's when it started. I went to the same campus for 12 years, and none of those children were ever allowed to have anything to do with them.
It's interesting, Deirdre Capone, as we talked to you. I grew up in Chicago, too. on the north side of things. And, Al Capone, when I grew up, was a mythical character, real, but mythical. You would
Right.
go down into the city, down from the northern suburbs, right? Down into the city.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
there is that wonderful place, if I'm not mistaken, it's in the Loop. It's in sort of the basement. It's a restaurant, underground restaurant, where he used to like to eat, an Italian restaurant. Fairly famous.
Lower
Delicious.
Wacker.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Lower
it.
Wacker Drive. Yep. And
Now,
then
I
also
wonder,
the Green Mill. You know.
uh-huh.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I'm wondering how
You're welcome.
we have Rick Santorum running for president, and Newt Gingrich is now suddenly poof a Catholic, and religion is suddenly huge in this country to try to motivate people politically. And I'm wondering, how do people reconcile Al Capone's Catholicism and St. Mary's and all of that with what might be considered a little bit edgy business dealings?
I need to at least educate the people. There was this era of prohibition. You know, all of a sudden, the United States government and their, I don't even want to say wisdom, but they all of a sudden decided that alcohol was illegal. This was the roaring 20s. Women were bobbing their hair and shortening their skirts. Jazz was coming into being, and all of this revolved around alcohol. So all of a sudden, you couldn't get alcohol, and the people wanted it. And the people in the rural areas could, build their own stills and make their own alcohol. The people in the cities could not. They relied on somebody to provide it for them. My family called what they were doing a business. They called it the outfit. And they really prided themselves that they provided top quality alcohol to their customers. It wasn't something that was going to make them blind or kill them. I mean, they really did. They were really proud of what they did. Now, let's go back. In that era, the Italians were the low people on the totem pole. They were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. So all of a sudden, this business opportunity came along to my uncle and my grandfather, and of course, they took it. I mean, they had no chance to be a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman. So they took it. And, if you look, you probably know lots of people in Chicago who are Italian, whose grandfather or maybe even fathers worked inside that business, because that was a place that they could go and earn money to take care of their family. They could feed their family. They could clothe their family. They could educate their family. There was nothing else for them to do. I mean, some Italians took up, sweeping streets, but then they got this opportunity to make this money. But Al Capone and my grandfather rose to a point of position where there were 6 businessmen in Chicago that objected to it for 2 reasons. Number one, they invited my grandfather and my uncle to be part of an organization called the Trilateral Commission.
Sure.
That's what it was called back then. And they wanted my grandfather and my uncle to give money to the central banks, to fund the central banks of South American countries. My grandfather told me that he thought it was a scheme. He didn't trust banks. He thought that anybody that printed money, that could inflate money or deflate money for countries, was evil. So they didn't want to be part of that. So all of a sudden, these businessmen exposed themselves to the Capone boys, so the Capone boys knew what they were doing, and of course knew all the players in there. And then the second thing was that they were Italian, and Italians should not rise to that point of power in the 20s. I like to tell people, Al Capone and Ralph Capone were the first Italian millionaires in the United States of America. But they then set out to bring them down. And I point out in my book, Uncle Al Capone, the effort that they did, and how they really brought them down, and it was awful what they had to go through. So I think my family, my ancestors are up there, cheering me on. There's no one else in this world that can tell this story but me. I lived with them. They told me things. They made me promise that I would not write my book until all the original family members had died. I kept my promise, but I think anybody interested needs to know that there is a human being by the name of Al Capone. Was Al Capone a mobster? Yes. Was he a monster? No. Was Al Capone a villain? No. Was he a victim? Yes. So they need to know that. It's politics. I mean, it's the same thing that happens today. If the people in power, want to put somebody away, hey, it will happen.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Trilateral Commission and all of that, because it is totally of general interest to so many of us. We're talking right now to Deirdre Marie Capone. She is the grandniece of Al Capone, grew up with Al Capone, was right in the heart and soul of that family, has a new book called The Untold Story from Inside His Family. Harrison with you. You are watching The Smart Show. We are also on KPFK 90.7. We are on Mondays from 3 to 5, 3 to 4 the first hour on 90.7 FM, second hour online. We will probably be bringing Deirdre back for a second broadcast down the road. And right now, we're presenting her in our special adjunct hangout, which, of course, is streaming live everywhere. And we're talking about her uncle Al Capone and discovering her book, The Untold Story from Inside His Family. And we have that piece of audio, Deirdre, right now, that audio of Al Capone speaking off of your website. Let's take a listen and hear the actual voice of Al Capone.
I came to Chicago with $40 in my pocket. My son is now 12. I'm still married and I love my wife dearly. We had to make a living. I was younger than I am now and thought I needed more. I didn't believe in prohibiting people from getting the things they wanted. I thought prohibition was an unjust law, and I still do.
Well, for sure. And thankfully, the Constitution was finally altered after the people spoke out as loudly as they did. And your family, your history, and I mean, you really are. Your family was instrumental in redefining this last century that we just left. Much of things like the FBI and all of this was born out of a whole lot of the activity. Your contributions, not willing contributions, I'll point out, but just the existence of that business gave birth to a major interconnected federal government that we might not otherwise have. A side effect of their appetite to go after a form of business that somebody else politically decided to get rid of the booze. You guys jumped in, as did the Kennedys and many, many, many others. My family from Chicago, we certainly drank plenty of your product, I'll say that.
There's another thing that I want to point out to people. Because of what happened in Chicago, because of what my grandfather saw that people wanted, he went to Las Vegas. He opened the first upscale casino in Las Vegas. It was called Paradise, and he petitioned the legislature in Nevada to legalize gambling, prostitution, and alcohol, and they did it. And look at Las Vegas today.
I try not to. I'm kidding.
I know. I don't either. I was just out there for the opening of the mob museum, and it was like, get me out of here.
Let's talk for a second about the Trilateral Commission, because there's a universe of people, quite clearly, who know this is out there, but they can't quite pinpoint it or really understand or wrap their head around it. You, as the grandniece of Al Capone, Deirdre, do you pronounce it Deirdre?
Deirdre, yeah.
Deirdre. I was going to say the British pronunciation, but we don't want to do that to you. Deirdre, right?
I know. No,
Yeah.
no.
Deirdre Marie
Correct.
Capone,
Correct.
the surviving relative of Al Capone, direct lineage. The Trilateral Commission went to Al Capone to try to do something. Tell us a little bit about the Trilateral Commission from the perspective of a Capone, a real life interaction with them.
What my grandfather told me is, you know, they went, Joe Kennedy suggested that they come to ask Ralph and Al Capone to be part of it. What they were looking for are people that had a great access to cash, and the cash could be put into, this organization that would fund and open these central banks of, back then it was strictly South American countries. And these central banks, like a Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve has nothing to do with our government. The Federal Reserve is owned by individual people, but they print money for the United States of America, and they can, decide to devalue or inflate that money at will. Very recently, I believe the dollar, or whatever they call it, in Brazil was devalued by quite a bit, and all these people, are left with cash that, means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and they did that, by the way, there was
wanted.
such a national debt, such as we're seeing here in this country, and by
Correct.
simply devaluing the money
Correct.
and saying that a dollar is now worth zero, you now owe nothing. You're not in debt anymore. Poof.
Correct. The debt is gone. It's like poof, it's gone. And my grandfather was a businessman. Al was the out front man. He loved to be in the limelight and stuff. My grandfather did not. And so my grandfather, after my father committed suicide just before my 11th birthday, my grandfather, passed when I was 34. And in those years, he really, told me a lot of things from inside. But he made me promise that I would not write any, book or tell any of this information until all the original family members had died. But he was the one that told me about that. I had no understanding of that kind of finance until he sat down and told me about it. But now I'm seeing it all over the place. I'm going, yeah, that's what my grandfather said was going to happen.
What's your life like when, as a Capone, you walk into formerly Marshall Fields, I don't know what it's called now, but you walk into a shop, a store, a restaurant, and they say, your last name, ma'am, and you say Capone. Do they pause?
Well, Capone is my maiden name. And so my father used his middle name as, my surname for a lot of years. And then I got married. So right now, nobody knows me as Capone. The only way I use my Capone name is for writing the book and promoting the book. I will tell you about my children. I have 4 children. I have 14 grandchildren. I didn't tell my children about their heritage until they were teenagers. One day, one of my sons came home from school, and so I said, hey, what did you learn in school today? And he said, oh, we were studying about this gangster called Al Capone. And my heart leaped out of my chest and fell down to the floor. And I thought, I've got to tell them before they find out about somebody, from somebody else. So I got my husband, called the children into the kitchen, 4 children, and they knew something was up because, I'm hanging on to my husband's hand. And I said, kids, I've got something to tell you. That I was born Deirdre Marie Capone. Al Capone is my uncle. And these 4 kids looked at me, then they looked at each other, they looked back at me, and the 4 of them in unison went, cool, Mom. That's so cool. I mean, I was not prepared for that. I thought that they were going to hate me because for so much of my life, I hated being a Capone. Kids weren't allowed to play with me. I was fired from my first job when they found out who I was. I was date raped as a young girl because this guy wanted to be part of the outfit, and he thought that, then I would give him, verification to be part of it. I was, threatened to be murdered a couple of times because, I was this Capone. I mean, it just went on and on. So I was not prepared for that reaction from my children. But this is a different time. If you just all of a sudden found out that you were related to Madonna or, somebody, really big and famous, you go, whoa, that's pretty cool. So I was not prepared for that.
Yeah, and greater than I think just big and famous. There's something about powerful people. It could be a famous somebody.
And he was powerful.
Yeah, Al Capone was not a layabout.
No, he was powerful. He ran probably the most powerful organization. My grandfather told me, because my grandfather ran things, he said, Deirdre, at one point, I was running 300 different businesses, hiring, paying, the wages and stuff like that. Just think about that. 300 different businesses. He did not have a computer, a cell phone, or a fax machine, and they all worked. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I have a friend I'm in West Hollywood, California. You're in Chicago. Deirdre Marie Capone, direct lineage of Al Capone, really the last surviving member. Is that right?
Well, I'm the last member of this family that was born with the Capone name.
Mm-hmm.
All the other, men in the family changed their name before they ever had children. So Sonny had 4 daughters, 3 of whom are still surviving. Sonny is Al's son, but they were not Capones. They all changed. He changed his name.
And so my friend here in West Hollywood is from a famous mob family in New Jersey, and he's a gay guy. And so his family moved him out here 20 years ago because they figured he would be vulnerable to being kidnapped, being held hostage, screwing with him based on that. So he came out here. He retains his same last name, but, it's L.A. Who? Totally different. But I imagine you must...
Yeah.
I imagine from hearing you talk, what went on in school and just having that name is that, it's impossible for him to go back to New Jersey. Just landing on the airplane, somebody's going to know because his family's still active, whereas the Capone family has retired.
Okay.
But it still carries with it a certain power. If you go marching in and go, I want that now, I'm a Capone, I think people are more likely to say, yes, ma'am.
Well, let me tell you a story about my aunt. There was only one girl in the Capone family. Everybody else was boys. And it was my Aunt Matthew. She was Mafalda, my Aunt Matthew. And she really was like a mother to me. So in her later years, she became kind of needy. And so her husband had to put her into a nursing home. And I used to go and visit her there. And this one time, she pulled me down and she said, Deirdre, tell them who I am. Tell them that we are Capones. Maybe they will treat me better. That was sad.
Well, I just think it would be fun to, get a credit card, your last name, or talk to the phone company and just throw out Capone and really get some first-class service.
Well, Capone in Italy is a very common name. It's much like Smith or Jones is here in America. And there are Capones. There is one that's an actor on IMDb, and his last name is Capone. And they are now claiming that they are related to Al Capone. They are not. I mean, in order for us to be related, we must have a common ancestor. And I've talked to Dominic, and there is no common ancestor. In fact, his family traced his family roots all the way back to Sicily, and we are not from Sicily. We are from Italy. So, yeah, there's a lot of people out there that are now saying, yeah, his name is Capone. So, I mean, absolutely can use that name. But he's now, living in the limelight where for most of my life I hid who I was. It was different.
Well, I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I've only a third of the way through. I can't wait to finish it. It's called Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family, and it's by Deirdre Marie Capone, who's with us right now. We would love to have you back on the radio down the road, maybe in the next couple of weeks for a quick interview as well, and have you share with us this really fascinating story. And once I finish gobbling down your entire book, I'm going to have a much better idea of some of the various other things that we can discuss. Thanks again for writing this. Thanks again for being public about it, because this is part of our American history. And if all we've got is Warner Brothers telling us how it all turned out, boy, are we blind.
Do you like the book so far?
I really do. I think you're a great writer.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right now, it's the #1 bestseller on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. #1 best-selling paperback.
Well, it stands to reason.
There's a couple of Kindles that sell better, but yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I would love to get a hard copy, by the way. I've got the ebook here, but a hard copy, and if you would even scrawl something in it, it would be a meaningful moment for me.
I would love to do that. Okay. I will definitely do that. I thought you had gotten that from my publicist, but I will send one to you.
I have the ebook, and while it's
a
meaty PDF file, it ain't the same.
No, it isn't. You need to hold it. I'm still a book person. Yeah, I still have to have the books.
See, there's 8 of us that can still read. Bless us all.
And still want to hold a book.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Deirdre Marie Capone. We're going to have you on a little later. Harrison with you. You have been watching The Smart Show. Don't forget, you can join us this coming Monday from 3 to 5 Pacific time. That would be 6 to 8 Eastern time for The Smart Show on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, streaming live on GoHarrison.com. Want to thank Billy Foster, as always, our minister of all things technical. A girthy, monumental equation of zeros and ones, constantly bifurcating into a madness of computorial genius. Also, our show mom, Yvonne, at the bottom of your screen, who keeps us highly disciplined, for we would otherwise falter. And our guest,